Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today's card uses the Mondo Poinsettia set and matching dies by Ellen Hudson. I'm using the small poinsettia and the 2 leaves, and here are the dies. I'm also using a My Favorite Things checkerboard stencil, and I'm going to be putting some embossing paste on this card. So to get started, I'm going to take my stencil and place it over a piece of cardstock. This is just 4 1/4 by, I think, around 4, something like that. I'm going to be trimming it out, so it doesn't really matter how long it is. I'm going to tape my stencil to my cardstock with some surgical tape. And because I'm trimming it at the top and the bottom, it doesn't really matter if the tape is on the top. But because I want it to extend out on both sides, I'm going to put the tape on the back of the stencil for the sides. And that'll keep it in place and make sure that the stencil doesn't move on top of my cardstock. So here's my embossing paste. I'm going to use a palette knife to spread it. I like to pick it up with the back of the palette knife. It's really hard to maneuver that paste onto your stencil with the top of it. So that's kind of the trick to get a nice even layer, is to take the paste on the back of the palette knife and kind of scrape it across the top. Sometimes it's nice to have a rough edge, but in this particular case I'm going to be putting some embossing powder on it. So I'm going to be spreading it out really nice and smooth. You can see I'm counting it out a little bit because I'm going to be using about 9 rows. I like to take my stencil off as soon as I'm done applying my embossing paste. So I'm going to go ahead and take this off very carefully, pulling it upward. And then I'll remove all of this tape. I'm going to be putting some embossing powder on top of the wet paste, but the paste stays wet for a pretty long time, so you have plenty of time. And I'm actually going to clean up my whole area before I apply the embossing powder. So now that everything's clean, I'm using the ultra thick clear embossing powder. It's called UTEE, Ultra Thick Embossing Enamel. And this powder is really not like a powder, it's more like a granulated sugar. It's kind of got these thick crystals, and you just put it right on top of your paste and it will stick to it. And I'm going to just make sure I have good coverage, and then I'm going to let it dry. So I'm not going to heat set it just yet. I'm going to show it up to you close so you can see how thick these crystals are. So anyway, I'm going to let that dry and work on some other things, and then I'm going to heat set it a little bit later. So I'm going to start working on my stamps. I've got my 3 stamps that I'm going to be using laid out on my blocks. I'm using some Memento Tuxedo black ink because I'm going to be using Copic markers, and that is the best ink for Copic markers. And I'm going to be stamping the large leaf once and then the small one twice. I colored this poinsettia a couple of weeks ago with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush watercolor pens, and I'm going to be using the same exact technique I used then, except now I'm using Copics. I'm going to take the R89, my darkest color, and I'm going to color just inside that bottom edge, just a very thin line. And then I'm going to take the R89 and color just a little bit above that black line that goes through the middle of the petal. So I'm not coloring on top of the black line, I'm coloring just above it. And then I'll take my R27 and just blend out the R89 just a little bit. So I'm not going to color too far out, just to get that R89 blended. Then I'll take the R22 and do that same exact thing, a little blend just to get that R27 blended out. The more of the same color you apply, the darker it is. So even if I'm just using R22 and I'm coloring and coloring and coloring, it's getting darker and darker, which is what I'm doing right now. So with the rest of the leaf, I'm just going to do a clean swipe of 1 or 2 layers of color just to make sure that it's as light as possible. And that will be kind of the highest, if you will, part of each of these petals. So I'm going to show you one more here. This is the R89 again, just the inside edge of the bottom of the petal. And then the same thing with the black line in the middle. Blending that out with the R27 just a little bit. And then I'll take the R22 and do that same exact thing, one more above the R27. And the reason why I don't want to go all the way to the top is because then I'll get the same R22 shade all the way on the whole petal. And I want to get just a lighter version of it for the top. 1 swipe for that and 1 swipe for that. And that'll complete the petal. So that's how I did all of these petals. And notice that I did the bottom edge, so my poinsettia is facing upward, and so think of the light as coming downward. And you can see that I did R89 on the bottom of each of those petals. And I'm going to do the leaves the same exact way. YG17 is my darkest color. I'm going to color the bottom inside edge, and then I'll color the middle inside edge. I'm going to blend that out a little bit with my YG25, and then I'll come back in with my YG23 and finish it off. These colors blend a little bit easier together because they're closer in number, so it was easier to fill this in. And with the leaves, my YG17 isn't very dark, so I added another layer of that to the bottom and the center, just to give it a little bit more dimension. So I did all three of these the same way, but notice on that small one, I flipped it over because I'm going to be having one leaf coming out of one side of the petal and one leaf coming out of the other side of the, poinsettia. And so I want to make sure that the shadowing is on the bottom of each of these. So I'm going to have to reverse it for that second one. I purchased the Wink of Stella Christmas pack, I guess it is. It came with white, red, and green. So I'm taking my green Wink of Stella pen and adding a little bit of shimmer just to the darkest areas. And this pen actually does have color in it, and so it's not a color that will blend in my leaf, so I need to make sure that when I add it, I don't create any kind of lines that look like they're not blended. And then for my poinsettia, I also wanted to add a little bit of shimmer. So I just took the clear pen. I do have red, but I didn't want to add red because I kind of liked the coloring the way it was on my poinsettia. And I just colored over the R89 areas with the clear Wink of Stella pen. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all this out in my Big Shot with the matching dies. In the meantime, my embossing paste has dried, so it's time to heat set this. And you'll notice that the UTEE actually heat sets a little bumpy the first time it's applied because it's so granular. You can see how it's bumpy. So what I like to do is one more layer, and you could put your stencil back on there and use a Versamark ink pad and ink up the squares, or what I like to do, it's a little cleaner, is to take a Versamarker pen and color the tops of each of these squares. I'm going to just do 3 rows at a time so I can keep track of what I'm doing, and I'll apply the UTEE and it will stick to it even though it's a Versamarker and not a Versamark ink pad. And then I'll heat set it. And sometimes also you should know that you have to heat set the UTEE a little bit longer. You know, sometimes you don't like to leave your heat tool on the clear powder too long because it might make it matte. Well, in this case, the longer you leave it, the nicer it melts. So you can see how smooth the surface is. It's almost like glass. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of these squares and heat set them, and here it is all finished. You can see how nice and clean and pretty it looks. I'm going to go ahead and trim this out, and because I didn't want any partial squares, I'm actually going to have to trim this out a little bit less than 4 1/4 wide, and you'll see what happens in a minute here. So I've also cut a piece of black cardstock to be matted behind, so I'm going to go ahead and stick that to it right now. I've got my ATG, I'll put some on the back, and then my new technique of using the Misty, I've been using this all the time, I love it. Put my black cardstock down first, and then I'm going to line up my left edge, and as soon as I feel that hit the left edge, I'm going to lay it down on my black cardstock. And even though I've got a mat at the top and the bottom, it should still line up as long as my left edge is straight. So because I cut that white panel with the squares a little bit shorter than 4 1/4 and my black is 4 1/4, I'm just going to trim off that right side with a scissor. Alright, now it's time to put my poinsettia together. I'm just arranging it on my craft mat so it's the way I like it, and then I'll carefully take my poinsettia off, and I'm going to put some tape runner on top of the leaves as best as I can without moving them. They are going to move a little bit, but at least they'll still be in the general area. It keeps sticking to my finger. And then I'll take my poinsettia and lay it on top of my leaves and stick it. So I put my whole kind of piece together, and then I'll put it on top of my checkerboard. So I'm going to press that down so my leaves stick to the poinsettia where I want them. And then I'll flip the whole thing over, and I'm going to take some Tombow Mono multi-glue. And I'm using this because my cardstock that's underneath it has those glass tiles on it, and it's textured, and so rather than risking that the tape runner won't stick to it, I know the glue will stick to it. So I'll place it where I want it, and then I'll grab my acrylic block and place it on top just to weight it down a little bit so that it dries nice and snug. I'm going to pull the sentiment from this Hero Arts Holiday Sentiment set. I think it's called Holiday Sayings. And I'm using the grid sheet and my Misty to get this lined up. I've just temporarily put my checkerboard panel on top there so I can see where my sentiment needs to go. I'm going to ink this up with some VersaFine Black Onyx ink, and then when I close my lid, it'll stamp it exactly where I want it to be. And then finally, I'll take my panel with the poinsettia. I'll put some tape runner on the back, and then again use the MISTI to adhere it exactly where I want it, right against that left edge. And then because I had that panel a little bit less than 4 1/4, I have that extra space on my card base, and rather than using a scissor, I went ahead and trimmed it off in my trimmer, and it worked just great. So anyway, that is the card for today. Nice and clean and simple, and I love the shiny glass tiles in the background. I hope you do too, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.